and all. Welcome to the Housing and Safety Committee meeting. We got new names. I got to get used to it. I'm Victoria Watlington, your committee chair and District 3 representative. We will start out with quick introductions. We've got most of our committee here in the room. So we'll begin with my vice chair to the left.
Good afternoon, LaWanna Mayfield, committee member, vice chair.
Good afternoon, Renee Johnson, District 4 committee member.
And I don't believe we have anyone else online right now from the committee standpoint, so I will also give our wonderful guests an opportunity to introduce himself.
Braxton Winston at large and serving as Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. We are flanked on both sides by incredible staff here at the City of Charlotte that give us support here. Oh, and I see that our committee member, Mr. Tariq Bakari, has joined us. We'll give him a moment to get settled, but I will turn it over to Assistant City Manager, Ms. Renee Askew, to begin with the staff introductions.
Renee Askew, Assistant City Manager, and this will be led by Sean Heath, Director of Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Thank you very much. This is Sean. Keep going around the room.
Lauren Livingston with the Office of Constituent Services.
Gail Whitcomb, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Rebecca Hefner, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Allison Craig, Planning.
Thank you kindly. We've got two items, pretty significant items on the agenda today that we will go ahead and jump into. The first one being the Housing and Jobs Summit Planning. If you have been tuning into our previous committee meetings.
Sorry, Chair. Since we're not doing a WebEx, we're going to start live on the WebEx. Can we start with the introductions again? I'm sorry.
Sure, no problem. Down.
They don't have to operate it, so. Okay, they're ready now, so I'll say. Studio going live.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Housing and Safety Community Meeting. I am Chair Victoria Watlington, serving as your District 3 representative as well. We've got a good bit on the agenda today, so we will start with introductions, beginning with my Vice Chair to the left.
Thank you, LaWanna Mayfield, Vice Chair, Council Member at Large.
Renee Johnson, District 4 committee member.
Tariq Bakari, committee member.
Thank you so much, and we are joined by our Mayor Pro Tem.
Braxton Winston serving at large and as Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you so much. We are flanked on both sides by our incredible staff who offers us wonderful support. We will begin with staff introductions, starting with Assistant City Manager.
Assistant City Manager, Renee Askew.
Sean Heath, Director, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Lauren Livingston, Office of Constituent Services.
Gail Whitcomb, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Rebecca Hefner, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Allison Craig, Planning.
Thank you so much. As I said, we've got a full agenda, but with only two items. The first one being the Housing and Job Summit Planning. If you have been tuning into our previous committee meetings today, you'll know that we are working to line out our agenda for our Housing and Job Summit. And so we're going to do that here today from a housing and safety and community lens. So we will start with that. We'll begin with a short video to frame our discussion, and then I will turn it over to Sean and team to tee up our discussion.
Promise, then we should apply the same tools of capitalism that built white wealth to build wealth in low-status communities, especially in terms of property ownership and real estate development, because real estate development in low-status communities in the U.S. currently takes one of two paths. The first, poverty maintenance, wherein you'll see things like the concentration of things such as health clinics and government-subsidized housing, rental housing, pharmacies, philanthropic and government dollars pour in, and the nonprofit industrial complex seems to view poverty sort of as an authentic cultural attribute of the area, and thus you'll see all sorts of programs that are designed to sort of manage that poverty, but the communities do not improve. Money will be made, lots of it, but not for the local people. And in fact, one can view many of the well-intentioned programs as talent extraction. Because the promising talent is encouraged to grow up and be somebody, but certainly not in their own hood. And the other type is gentrification displacement. When urban populations grow, even some politicians and even some activists will resist greater density. So you have rising demand and limited supply, and then prices go up. And gentrification generally means outsiders coming in through a community in order to build one that's like suits their needs and their desires. And it's not for the needs and desires of the people that are already in that community. But let's just be real. It's not always mutually exclusive, because people in those communities want nice things too. They do. And that's why they leave whenever they can in order to experience them. So capitalism can fuel gentrification and displacement or poverty maintenance, but neither of these strategies actually help the people in those communities live in the kind of neighborhoods that we all deserve. What if we looked at low status communities as though they were struggling companies? How would we turn them around? How would a talent retention model work on a neighborhood scale? So municipalities, they hand out corporate retention deals because they believe that the economic activity that it'll produce is actually worth the subsidy that they pay out. And so we'll need to do the same thing in low status communities for the people that we were led to believe that they need to measure success by how far they get away from those places. So we can't really force anybody to stay, but we can nudge them with lifestyle infrastructure, the type of stuff that we learned through our own market research that people told us that they wanted. Places like cafes and bars and bookstores and farmers markets and, the places that, frankly, you probably all like to go to too. They build positive community interactions and make people feel really cool. So another nudge would be real access to property ownership and business ownership that keeps people vested in their neighborhoods. These are like benefits, and company stock options, the kind so when the community does well, so do the residents. It's kind of like the employees of a hot startup. So how do we make sure that these benefits and stock options get in the right hands and appreciate and value for them? Now, in the U.S., if you're accused of a crime and can't afford legal counsel, a public defender will be assigned to you. The same can be done for local property owners. Before a real estate transaction goes forward within a low-status community, the seller should receive quality legal and financial counsel so they are fully aware of the value of their land and how they could maximize it through sensible refinancing by building, vertical additions for rentals and also, accessory dwelling units, and also using the value to do sensible refinancing, put their kids through college, build a business. Or maybe, since property owners might even be considered a protected class by the United States Security and Exchange Commission in order to protect Black wealth in particular and other low-status community wealth from the continuing liquidation that they still deal with. Because it is common for people who do own property in low-status communities to be approached all the time for quick cash offers. These are actual solicitations that I've received at my home. They can be very enticing to people who have never been led to believe that there's any real value in their community. And the thing is, it's all legal. And real estate companies, big and small, as well as private equity, have done a very effective job of increasing wealth inequality in the U.S. by separating financially unsavvy people from any hope of generational wealth potential.
So, we begin with this talk as a backdrop or a framing of the discussion that we are having. Many of us have said that not only do we want to talk about housing, we want to talk about how jobs and housing and mobility work together. Because essentially what we'd like to see is for people to be able to afford their housing because they have better wages. And so when we start to think about how economics work in our system, how do we think about using the same principles that are working in our system, but tweaking them in such a way that we can make sure that we're creating equity? So what I'd like to do is we can start at the the right, we'll begin with Mayor Pro Tem. I'd like to just hear initial thoughts, comments about not just the video, but about this idea that we've really got to think about housing and economic development and mobility together.
Yes, well, thank you for the video. I heard her speak about the work that she's done in the South Bronx, about bringing folks home. I'm, of course, I feel her because I come from the New York City community, and it's all about go out. Everybody tells you go out and make some of yourself. Get out of here, and that is never really totally. I don't know. That was always uncomfortable to me, right? Because you want to ascend and bring your folks back up, right? Generally speaking, with this Housing and Jobs Summit, I think the deliverables should be what are the policies and or kind of budgetary spends that we're looking at. So I like that you're really looking at how can we look at the goals that are set out in the comp plan that relate to the work of this committee and the paradigm that we put forward. I'm going to raise another issue up that I raised up in the economic development discussion, childcare, something that I've spoken to. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll pause you only because what I failed to do was, I'm sorry, I'm going to pause you before you get into the specific policy piece, because one thing that we're going to do right after we get the initial reactions is talk through the policies that are here, and then definitely want to hear you on that item.
All right.
Can we comment on the video?
Not the video specifically, but the idea of combining the housing and the affordability piece with the economic mobility and the jobs piece.
Well, I mean, you know that I'm more passionate about that than anything else. I think that's an imperative. And anyone who knows me knows I spend almost every waking minute of my regular day problem solving these topics. And they are incredibly challenging, incredibly complicated. I mean, the fourth industrial revolution, which we're in the middle of right now, is taking middle America and is absolutely pushing it to the edges of the bottom and the top in a very unproductive way. And it's an existential threat. So I'm all for it. I don't necessarily know how this council's going to be able to tackle it. We can't even pass a calendar item on the agenda right now, and we're going to take on the world's greatest threat. I just, if there's a chance to do it, I think that means we have to scope it so narrow and have such a targeted discussion that we don't get into these punchlines of, the standard kind of refrains, and we actually try to problem solve something. I don't know if we could even do that, but if there was a chance, I would say let's focus on one building on one plot of land, hypothetically in Charlotte, and see how we would connect those dots. Because if we do anything bigger scope than that, it will be destined for a lot of fun conversation that doesn't go anywhere.
I agree that the comments need to be combined and look forward to hearing how we are willing to tackle that particular assignment.
My first question is, who is the audience for the summit? Who's the audience? One of the things that the presenter talked about was educating the community. Are community members a part of this discussion? I'd like some clarity on the expectations for the summit. When you talk about educating the community, I presented that information to our previous planning director of contracting with the realtor in educating residents in vulnerable neighborhoods. That's absolutely imperative. They're at a disadvantage because the developers have information that the residents do not. So I absolutely support and encourage and advocate for educating residents. So if that can be a part of it, I just want some clarity on the summit. Who's the audience and the format? I'd like some clarity. Thank you.
while we were talking, we've been joined by one of our colleagues. I know you may not be here for a long time. I just wanted to give you a moment to introduce yourself for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. James Mitchell, just here sitting on the first agenda topic, so thank you.
Sure. And with that in mind, we can pivot to the more specifics around the Job Summit. Right now, what are potential options for topics? And then we can talk about who's the audience and what we want that to look like. I think at this point, we're really in a position to give those kinds of directions to staff for what we want to see. So, Sean?
Thanks, Councilmember Watlington. We can jump straight to slide 4. I recognize each of you have spoken about this at least once already in previous committees. And what we really attempted to do here with this slide is review the comp plan, where there are over 350 recommendations, and pull out what we thought were 12 areas of interest that are aligned with the charge of this committee. With a couple of exceptions, we did pull in, I would cite specifically number 1 and 11 and 12 that aren't necessarily within the swim lane for this committee. But we felt it was important to recognize that there's more than housing to the summit, right? And a recognition that if economic mobility is really what the emphasis is on, then there needs to be a heavy dose of job training, workforce development, job growth, jobs focus at the summit itself. So I wanted to acknowledge that. These 12 aren't necessarily intended to be the 12 things that are discussed at the summit. You may have 12 other things that you'd rather discuss. We just thought these would be conversation starters. To Councilmember Bakari's point, the idea isn't to identify 12 items to discuss. It might make for a more meaningful summit if it's a much shorter list. So this is a menu of options to start with to get things going. And Councilmember Johnson, to your question, really we were hoping from a staff perspective that through the course of all the committee conversations today, that we walk away with a better understanding for what are the things you want to talk about, what's the audience that you want to have there, when do you want to have it? You know, we've heard some discussion about trying to do it before the end of the year. Logistically, that could get a little challenging, but we'd love to hear from you on what you want. And then that'll give us something to react to and build out an agenda and an invitation list, et cetera. So I didn't have any intention on going through any of these in line item detail, just in the interest of time. I was going to turn it back over to the chair to let you seek feedback from committee members as you see fit.
Lines into the record just to get an understanding of what's before us and give folks an opportunity to react and respond. So the first one under our comp plan goal, 10-minute neighborhoods, is access to service and amenities like banking, childcare, groceries, healthcare, et cetera. The things that, just like the speaker in the video mentioned, the things that draw people to neighborhoods and what makes people want to actually be in neighborhoods that also drive up home values. The second goal from the comp plan being neighborhood diversity and inclusion. When we look at these potential topics, they include barriers to innovative housing solutions like tiny homes, ADUs, modular housing, tools and strategies for protecting residents of high vulnerability to displacement, strategies to advance inclusionary zoning. And then when we come to housing access for all, we're looking at things like resources to develop more affordable units, preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing, land strategies to expand affordable housing, access to home ownership opportunities, neighborhood strategies to mitigate housing impacts associated with the growth of corporate landlords, resources and programs in support of residents facing severe housing instability or seeking to transition from homelessness to permanent housing, and then finally, diverse and resilient economic opportunity. Job training and workforce support services focused on underserved areas and historically disadvantaged populations, and job growth in areas lacking access to employment opportunities. So with that, I will open up the floor to get reactions and also a sense of what policy areas that folks have the most energy around. I'll start with the committee members, but definitely Mayor Pro Tem want to hear your insight. Vice Chair?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Sean, this is for clarification. Number 8 is access to home ownership opportunities. When we're looking for me, the summit needs to look at the realities that we're dealing with today. We're in a very different market. Housing, right now, housing stock is sitting out there a lot longer, some up to 51 days on the market. Interest rates has a large part in that conversation, not to mention the investors either international and local investors that have purchased or invested in entire single-family neighborhoods. So when we talk about access to home ownership opportunities, I hope we're having some very real conversations around education. Because having a 7% plus interest rate on a home where if we did a snapshot, the price of that exact same residence in 2018 versus what it is today, over 150 plus thousand. I'm doing a search now, just a general search. We have real estate agents and partners that we can work with that need to be a part of this conversation. So if we as a committee have a chance to have a longer conversation to try to narrow these 12 down, I just hope that it's 12 where we're bringing people, not only addressing the issues, but bringing some solutions to those concerns that are actually feasible. The preservation, number 6, preservation of naturally affordable housing, preservation of multifamily, older multifamily units. We're losing hotels that have been long-standing residential homes for a number of our residents. So we have to have some real conversations of what are we really facing right now in the Charlotte area, and we need to be honest about where we have an opportunity to actually try to address some of this versus the market is at play and we have some limitations. I would like this to be focused on where local government can actually, either through our partnership with the county, through school partners that have access to land, where can we actually be beneficial in moving the needle in this conversation? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. I do have a follow-up question for you. This is the conversation where we can narrow. So if you had to pick the ones that stood out to you right off, which ones are you most interested in discussing at a summit?
I will have it by the time you come back around.
Cool. And I do want to recognize Councilmember Molina has joined us. Do you have a, oh, you have a
Do I need to?
No, you're fine. I just want to make sure you had a
Yeah.
mic. Councilmember Johnson?
I think it really depends on who the audience is. I mean, is this summit for us to discuss, or are we bringing in members of the public? Is it going to be broadcast via Facebook? I'm trying to envision what this looks like. If it's for residents, that's going to change the discussions.
What would you prefer?
I prefer that it be open to residents.
Okay.
Yeah, for the public. When Mr. Heath mentioned a meeting in December or before the end of the year, we as a council have talked about a broader meeting for the council specifically to discuss the impact of the growth in infrastructure in the city. But a housing and jobs summit, I picture this, when you say 2 days, I imagined it for, interested landlords and residents. So I'd like to see education regarding, like you said, what's the market look like now? How do you stay in your home? There was an example, and I've mentioned this several times. An owner in Hidden Valley sold their property to a developer, I think in January, February, for $80,000. The developer turned around and sold it by the end of the year for $270,000 because they had knowledge and they had information. So that's the kind of information that's what I think our residents need to know. It preserves wealth, it's equitable, and it prevents displacement. So I'd like to see education for our residents. Education, I mentioned this earlier, for the smaller landlords. What opportunities are available to help them create affordable housing or affordable NOAs? So I think, we've heard presentations on all of these topics numerous times. It's like singing to the choir almost. I think we need to educate our residents. So that's who I would prefer that this summit be open to. Thank you.
Mr. McCarty?
I think there's a lot of different ways you could go about this. the most impactful thing is I think the audience needs to be the council members. And it needs to be not about educating us. We need to come in there educated as we possibly can offline. And then we need to sit down and do the one thing we're here to do, which is brainstorm and see where we have agreement on innovative policy. And policy will fall out in a couple simple angles. If you picture, this is where I go back to where I said this is the only way we'll even have a shot at success, is if we narrow this down to say, here's a made-up plot of land in Charlotte, and let's talk about the ways you could build or influence affordable housing on that. And I think some of the things are in relation to land use. And on some sides, it's how we use incentive dollars and how we talk about doing that. On other sides, it's the topic we never give any airtime, which is how we remove some of that cost burden that rezoning and permitting put on top of those things. I think on the other side, it's in deal making and how when someone comes forth requesting incentives for us for NOAAs or affordable housing, what strings are we going to attach to those dollars? And I think that's where, again, we've left a lot of opportunities on the table by just saying, here's the money and here's the number of units, rather than saying for 60% AMI, in order to fill these number of units, you have to have them connected directly to a workforce program, that the people are actively involved and they have transportation support and food and clothing and childcare support in order to have them get to an outcome. Or perhaps they are people in need of mental health in certain areas. So I think you have to get incredibly specific on one plot. And when anyone starts talking about theoretical high-level statements, we immediately scope it back in to say, how does that apply to this one specific plot of land, building, and the tools that we have today? And again, I still don't think that will work, but it will be as close as we could possibly get as a body right now to coming up with what the only tangible outcome that's going to matter in this, which is leaving with directionally understood policy innovations that would enable upward mobility through jobs and housing.
Thank you, sir. Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah, so I'm surprised Mr. Bakari didn't use these terms that I'm about to use. But my understanding is that the audience that this Housing and Jobs Summit was intended to be for was the council members. But with the idea that, hey, we've been working around the edges of things, but we need to be the lead agency, the lead partner in figuring out through our policy decisions how to lead to create an environment of upward economic mobility. That we've been dealing with affordable housing, we've been dealing with jobs, but we don't necessarily have a roadmap to how all these policies, how all these decisions, how all these discussions are going to lead to, us to make decisions in this next year and moving forward that really focus on the upward economic mobility issue. So as I've been listening to a lot of the conversations today in different committees, I think what's the overlapping theme is how do we understand barriers, right? What are the barriers to folks being able to participate in upward economic mobility? And in some senses, it's going to be the new economic situation that we're going into. It's going to be the need for a more comprehensive intergovernmental standpoint, transportation and planning implementations, or economic development and jobs. From a neighborhood standpoint, from a housing and housing safety and community committee standpoint, I think it's how do we really kind of understand what all those barriers are, and how do we start implementing policy in our neighborhoods, right? Generally speaking, and zoomed into specific areas. So really, that's kind of from a macro standpoint. That's what I thought we kind of why we did this in the first place. Why we talked about this months ago how do we kind of get there? And I think that there are some specific things that, we should touch on. Folks that, I don't know over the 2 days how staff will, structure this. But I think, we have to have a childcare aspect to these things, right? I think we have to have a digital equity part to this. These are things that, that specific things that I would like to deal with, and I think they do relate to the housing and neighborhoods kind of framework that we deal with in this committee.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Just from the first round of folks, we can go back around. I think folks have second things. What I'm hearing is a little bit of a mix between execution and outward focus and really a policy-based discussion. And I'm wondering then, Sean, if it's possible, or what would it look like to have kind of different arms? We're having this summit for the policymakers. Perhaps we invite policymakers from other areas in addition to ourselves, or policy, I'll say social entrepreneurs, folks that are really driving particular aims, and it can be very project specific and project based. What's going on around the country? Where have we seen these things work? Who's got the metrics that line up with it? And how can we, what's the same, what's different? But then also having this public facing component of workshops, if you will, or job fairs, or this very community connected piece where while this summit is going on, you're welcome to come in and watch or partake in that way, but there's also resources here. I think we could probably figure out how to do both there, but those are some of the things I'm hearing for myself. I think of this as like a rapid improvement event or like a value stream mapping event. To your point, Mayor Pro Tem, about barriers, what does if I am a person who, for instance, has been justice involved, as I'm walking along my path to try to get to stability, what are the who and what will I encounter along the way, and what are particular pain points? Obviously, I believe a lot of our partners have that information for us, but if we can hone in on what are those particular areas that are causing the hiccups, then we can focus our policy around there. So I definitely agree with that kind of approach because I think that's where the biggest bang for our buck is. A lot of the things we see and we know about, but when it comes to what's really specific about our policies that don't work together, I think we really have to get that from the end users. And then I hear the idea around narrowing scope to perhaps very project-specific things, and I think that creates a level of actionable outcomes. And I think in order to do that, we've got to think about our partners who are generating in this space. I heard talking about realtors, talking about our small investors. How do we get those people in the room in a way that's really going to deliver new policy? So as I look at this 12, what jumps out at me are land strategies to expand affordable housing, access to home ownership, and this idea around how do we deal with the growth of corporate landlords, because as we think about housing and jobs, if we're moving to a majority rental type market, then our people are just going to be at the mercy of the property owners. And I think that that's something that we've got to really look at from a policy standpoint, which obviously means that from an intergovernmental standpoint, we'll have some partners that we'll need to have. One idea that's been bouncing around is this idea of how is it possible to incentivize through our tax system people to sell their homes to owner occupants, because we know that that is a particular point in the process where if somebody is making the rational choice decision, they're going to sell to the highest bidder, right? And then how do we, as a public entity, think about operating as a developer? If we are an investment company and our outcomes are community-based, what does our SWOT look like? Well, we've got access to a much larger bucket than a lot of folks have. How do we leverage our funds in a way that we can show up in the market differently? Where would we invest if we were a private company? Would we be paying top dollar for some of these projects, or would we be looking in places that are in the future going to be in the path of progress, much in the same way that a lot of investors are doing now? So I just think that those are the kinds of approaches that we should be taking with the summit. I saw your hand up. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Definitely, we're on the same page of alignment of thinking of this a little differently. I also want to share that this morning, Councilmember Mitchell and I at our committee meeting, one of the things that was shared to think about that came from Councilmember Anderson is when we're looking at our upskilling and reskilling individuals and what that pipeline, and actually Councilmember Bakari, when he joined in, we talked about that pipeline for corporate relocation and what that could look like, and also who's that target. So what do we have, and the question came up is, what are we planning as far as we know that there are a lot of discussions regarding a impending recession? What does that look like for us in this conversation? We know that there's already some requests out there for additional funding, but we also know today the market is looking very different than it did even 6 months ago. How are we preparing ourselves so that we're financially strong to maneuver in these conversations? When we're looking at the target, and now that you've given me a little time, is 4 items that jump out for me. Number 3, the tools and strategies for protecting residents. Number 7, the land strategies to expand affordable housing. And what does that really mean? How do we leverage our city-owned land, of which we should be getting an update on where we are with city-owned land sometime in the near future. Number 9, neighborhood strategies to mitigate housing impacts associated with the growth of corporate landlords. Because I don't think we want to put government dollars in the market where an investor can convince someone to sell a home for $80,000 and then turn around and sell it for what I'm looking at now, $240,000 to $380,000, and we're considering that $300,000+ mark. And number 11, the job training and workforce support services. Also, what does our threshold look like? We have individuals out there that earn just above. It could be $5 or less above a threshold, but our assistance could help stabilize them. How flexible are we? Looking at years ago where we were more flexible with CDBG funds and how they can be implemented and utilized in local community, thinking that through. And then my last one was number 12, the job growth. Because again, if we're not connecting people to employment and giving opportunities for gainful employment, Councilmember Mitchell mentioned earlier, okay, if the living wage today is $20 or $25, what are we doing in that conversation? Which means if we're having a summit, our county partners, our Mecklenburg County Commission partners and staff have to be there because they're a part of this conversation, because it's only through collaboration that we're going to be able to make some of these major dents in the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any comment? Ms. Johnson.
Of course.
The way she raised her hand.
So I like 8, no, not 8, 9.
8 and 9 or
Well,
9?
8 is wonderful, but if 8's wonderful, but we have folks that are living on the street and cannot even afford rent. So as far as a hierarchy of needs, I would like us to really take some time and talk about the severe housing instability, especially when we know that many of our housing unstable are living in hotels and motels, and now developers are buying those. So we've got quite a problem. There are people living at rest stops here. I mean, it's just really bad. So we need to talk about that. So number 10, 11, and 12. I'd also like to hear the legal, we really need to understand from a legal perspective what resources we do have access to. There's something that, up here, how do we get, or strategies to advance inclusionary zoning. Well, is that realistic, or what would that take? Another legal issue that I think that's on the horizon is the HOA bylaws, and I heard something about them being obsolete or something after 30 years. I don't know but I don't know if the attorney can speak on that just a little, or if you don't have that information, that's fine. But we need to really understand the status of HOAs, and I heard something about that. I think it was from someone in our legal department. There's something in the North Carolina Supreme Court or something about the HOA status and the bylaws and a 30-year time frame. So we really have to understand from a legal perspective where we are as a policy-making entity. What can we actually do? So so for me, it's those items are a priority. They're all a priority. If we could talk about all 12, the first 2 days, and this is our first meeting, but it doesn't have to be the last. These are the kind of policy items that we should be talking about as a council periodically anyway. So they're all important, but for me, it's those items that I mentioned.
Thank you. Ms.
Thanks.
Molina?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My apologies for my tardiness, colleagues and friends. I'm actually listening to my colleagues. I'm only adding. I don't feel like I'm, expanding the conversation a whole lot and saying that when I first heard the idea of the Housing and Jobs Summit, I wanted to know, what was the objective? What are we doing? What is the proposed outcome? And so if it's from a policy position, then we are bringing together resources. So we're talking resources and implementation simultaneously. So are we going to now kind of test people, to bring them and say, here are some resources, or so I guess I want to make sure that I understand what our objectives are. And then, so we're walking into this, and I want to know, is it specifically to try and calculate outcomes from it? So we're bringing stakeholders who are city resources to the table, and we're looking at collectively what we're capable of. Am I correct in thinking that way?
We definitely contemplated bringing in folks from housing and jobs ecosystems,
Okay.
for sure.
Okay, so I'm coming directly from the economic development meeting. So I'm coming with that same idea in the back of my mind, where we were talking about Jobs Charlotte. We're talking about our initiatives that are going to help our community members. But, and for me personally, and this is personal to me, number 11 and 12 are top of mind for me. And that's because I feel like that if a person has access to training and, workforce support and even job growth, then we can begin. So I'm realistic in this, and realistic from a personal perspective, meaning that I have struggled in Charlotte, right? And I take away AMI, take away, sounding politically correct, take away all of those things. And I think understanding that, there's 10 different things that we can talk about that's going to help a human in our community. Like some of my colleagues said, people need access to transportation. They need access to childcare. They need access to jobs. They need access to what's affordable. What's affordable for two different people in two different circumstances who go to work every day can be totally different, right? And so, I just don't want to make this another conversation where we're having it just to have it, to say that we're throwing a dart at the wall, and hitting something and saying that we've done something. I really want to have an idea of what type of specificity we're looking at. I heard someone recently, Mr. Malcolm Coley from Ernst & Young, he humbled me with a comment that he made about the power that we have as a public institution. And across public institutions, we have a little over a $6 billion impact. And it is with partnering with the private industries that we're able to increase that impact with certain projects, where we have one in my mind in particular, where we've gone over the $200 million threshold in order to provide resources to our community members. But we're finite, in what our resources are. So I know that our job is to help everyone. I know it. And the constraints of what that means for us is that we're constrained by a $3.2 billion budget that has to pick up the garbage, it has to pay the police officers, it has to pay us, it has to pay you, and then it has to come up with resources strategically to take a shot at what are the problems among all of our community members. And so I think language is, and I heard our Mayor Pro Tem say this a long time ago, and I was on the other end of the screen, like jumping up and down, because there's a level of specificity where we say to somebody that this is what we're doing specifically, right? And we're doing it with this objective, but we're going to get there. You know, to, let's say, hypothetically, if we're speaking of AMI, and we're talking and targeting specifically 30% AMI, but if we're working to bring you out of 30% AMI, and we haven't even focused on 50% AMI, what happens when you get there? Do you understand what I'm saying? And then we have the constraints of a finite budget. So, like I said, I understand that we have this just immense scope of need, and I don't want to talk about it objectively and just do something to say that we've done it. You know, I feel like with all of the intelligence and capacity in our room, I feel like we can be very specific, and I feel like that we can define what that means. And I feel like that we got the people and the resources, and we got a great city, and we got people who we can partner with to help. And so how do we do that? And how do we frame that? And what type of project baseline are we looking at? You know, we're right now a brainstorming session. First thing comes to mind for me if I'm in a project, you know, and I'm developing a project, that's the first implementation of a project. If I'm defining the scope, I have a brainstorming session. Do I bring other people into a brainstorming session? If they're not a stakeholder, I've never seen a project that way. So if you are a part of the project and you're a stakeholder, then I include you in the brainstorming, because then you help me define what that baseline is going to be and create the milestones necessary in order to achieve the time and the budget, right? That's the way I see it. That's the way I was trained. That's the way I know it. So I just, like I said, everything's important. Like all of my colleagues are saying, everything is important. But I think we need to, we have to delve in, we have to dive in, and we have to be specific, and we have to make sure that we're developing a baseline. What baseline are we looking at? Where are we going? What are we doing? Like, we got 950,000 people. And I guarantee you somebody in most of those places got some kind of need, and we got $3.2 billion. It ain't even enough to crack the ceiling. What can we do?
Thank you. So, Sean, at this point, do you have any specific questions that you need direction from the council on in regards to the summit?
No, I think today is really an opportunity for us to hear from all the committees, and now we've got to figure out where to take it from here and translate this into something tangible. I think there is something to be said for, there's a distinction between what you can accomplish at the summit versus what you want to accomplish more globally with your housing and job strategies. And the summit can be kind of a good vehicle to be a catalyst for some of that stuff, but we can't do all of this in a summit per se. And that's why I think there may be something to be said for picking a few areas and keeping it narrow, but try to go deep. That may make for a more satisfying summit for council members. So
Yeah.
anyways, we'll reflect on everything we heard today.
Sure, and just to add to that, I think a lot of the things I heard too are pre-read type items, information that we would need in order to come in and offer something to the summit. For me personally, I would much prefer it show up as a work session, and we come out of there with some real policy pilots, if you will, or policy drafts, versus we came in and we learned a lot and then left without it actually turning into anything actionable. As we talk to stakeholders, one other group that I want to make sure that we add in here are our research partners, where I know that we've had some connections with RAND and others, as we really, really think about what's out there that we don't already know about, or what programs have been successful. Those are the places we want to start, because if we can spend our time figuring out how to tailor it to Charlotte in a meaningful way, I think that would be value add. So with that, one last comment, and then we're going to move to the second item on our agenda, because we've got, about 40 minutes?
Would this be an opportunity to hear from our committees, our ad hoc committees? I mean, I don't know, just something to think about. The NEST committee and the...
At the summit?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. If that's an opportunity to hear from them, maybe an update from them, or to receive at least a report from each committee prior to the meeting. So, yeah, reports from each committee so that we have something to review and know what's being worked on so that we're not like duplicating efforts or reinventing the wheel.
No, that makes sense, because really and
Thanks.
truly, a lot of the items that are in the NEST committee, for instance, should be resulting in some kind of policy that we would then look at. So as much as we can pull forward what's already in those committees and come out and see that, I think that that's a great way to drive that work forward. All right. Next up, we will move to our second item, and backed by popular demand, we are actually talking today about our development fees and particular ways that we can improve that process and make affordable housing more attractive to our development community. So with that, I will turn it over to Deputy Director, Ms. Rebecca Hefner, for an update.
Thank you. Indeed, popular demand. We have returned following our initial discussion last month of the policy referral related to development fees and what kind of options you all have to lessen the burden that development fees place on affordable housing development. So next slide, please. This is a reminder of the policy referral. The item was referred to committee in June, and you all had your first discussion last month in your committee meeting on October 3rd, looking at what are the fees associated with land development and what are some of the impacts those have on affordable housing. And at your request, staff from Planning and Housing and Neighborhood Services and Budget came together and put together a draft proposal for a pilot program that we are going to share with you all today. Next slide. Just to put this topic in context, again, we are looking at one piece of the pipeline here under construction. So many of the things in these boxes are places where the city already supports the development of affordable housing, and the reimbursement of development fees is not something that we have in our existing toolbox. This would be adding something into that one portion there. Next slide, please. And some context around the costs. This is information that we shared, the first two bullets, in the last meeting in October. So we looked at the Housing Trust Fund of projects that were approved since 2020, and the plan review fees for those projects averaged $20,000. The water infrastructure fees averaged a little over $230,000. And when we look at those fees altogether, that's, depending on the project, 1% to 2% of the total development cost for that project. And so when we talk about reimbursing these fees, especially when we get into the parameters, you'll see it's a small amount of money for the in contrast to the overall project. Now, this is based on a small sample of affordable-only projects, and we have been having some conversations with developers to get a sense on the market rate side if these percentages are comparable, so we can provide some additional information. But for today, the context is about $250,000 is an average project for fees. Next slide, please. And this is the option that you all chose in your last meeting. And what you had asked of staff is to think about what would a program look like, what kind of fees would be eligible, what funding source options do we have, what would the program parameters look like, and bring it back to you. And then that's where we are today. Next slide, please. When we think about fee reimbursement, there are two things that this would support. One, the production of affordable housing developments throughout the city. So this is developments like you see in the Housing Trust Fund that are fully affordable. All of the units are affordable units. That's primarily what we see in the trust fund. But also, we wanted to think about how might we use fee reimbursement as a way to also incentivize affordable units within what would otherwise be all market rate developments, similar to what you all have done with the development allowances you adopted in the UDO. The pilot program proposal would be to provide a grant to reimburse eligible land development and infrastructure fees for qualifying projects that incorporate affordable units. So that's a very generic way to say what I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. The baseline qualifications that staff recommends for this pilot program are similar to what's found in the UDO as adopted. 20% of the units in the development must be affordable to households at 60% AMI. This is state law. We shared and discussed this last meeting with input from our attorneys that the threshold has to be 20% at 60%. Affordability period of 30 years, minimum of 5 units. Again, these qualifications mirror the development allowances in the UDO. Maybe rental units or for sale, and would apply to new construction, acquisition, and rehab. And the baseline qualification would be, this is for projects that are not receiving other financial investment from the city. So as we looked at projects in the October committee meeting and shared where, for example, a housing trust fund might be a $3 million investment, that investment already covers the cost of fees for those developments. So this would be a program proposed for developments that do not already have financial investment from the city. And the recommendation here is to reimburse a percentage of the fees based on some tiered qualifications. So next slide, please. These are tiered qualifications that we would recommend based on what we've heard committee discussing. Some of the specific feedback from last meeting, as well as generally some of the things we've heard today around what do we require of our development partners when we are reimbursing funds. So the first tier would be the 50% reimbursement. This is a project that meets those baseline requirements, and then something that already is receiving public financial investment, just not city investment. So 4% tax credits and bond allocation projects, for example. You see them come across your council business agenda from time to time, where a developer has received bond allocation and tax credits from the state, but does not have city funding. So these are typically affordable housing developments. And we would recommend a 50% reimbursement. Those projects typically are making their numbers work with that other public investment. And the benefit of the city providing a fee reimbursement is that you would then be able to apply other policies to this property, such as your source of income protections, as well as be able to support these developments, which are often in parts of the city where your housing trust fund projects cannot go. The 75% reimbursement would be for projects that meet those baseline requirements and have no other public financial investment. So not the 4% tax credits, for example. But this would be if they didn't meet the qualifications of the 100% reimbursement, which are twofold. We're proposing, in response to some of your recommendations, that projects eligible for 100% reimbursement would prioritize units for voucher and subsidy holders and accept placements from the city's contracted partners, and would establish partnerships that promote upward mobility or provide on-site support services to residents. So I will be clear that we haven't entirely sorted out the how and the mechanism on these 2 bullet points. So that is, we have been working with our partners to talk through what that might look like and how we could make that possible. Some of those things are harder to monitor over a 30-year time frame than others, for example. And so we want to make sure that we are putting something in there that's actually measurable and impactful. Next slide, please. So any program would have some fees that are eligible and some fees that are not eligible. So we looked at the wide variety of fees that were part of our land development process last month. And the proposal here is that most of the fees under plan review and grading review, tree ordinance detention, rezoning, all of the standard fees there with the planning department and the review fees from the different departments that are part of the Charlotte Development Center would be eligible, and that would include tree mitigation fees. The Charlotte Water infrastructure fees, all of the ones we discussed and looked at that go into that average that we shared. So water and wastewater service connections, system development fees, permit fees, review, inspection, et cetera. Not eligible, we would recommend revisions, reinspection, resubmittal, so things that have to be done multiple times. Fees that are charged by other entities like Mecklenburg County building permit fees, fees associated with appeals and variances, or fees for enhanced and expedited review. So we can talk through any of those that you'd like more information on. Next slide. A couple of other considerations just want to think about. We did talk to some developers. We've set up a developer listening session, but we couldn't make it happen before this meeting, so we had some informal conversations. 20% at 60% is a pretty high bar. Especially if it's a market rate development. This is most likely a program right now that would be potentially feasible for developers who are in that mid-range of housing. So developing housing, rental housing in particular for 80% to 120, where you might be able to get some at 60% with the whole suite of incentives, for example, that are part of the UDO development allowances. And any project that gets to this 20% at 60% threshold would also be eligible for all of the development allowances that are in the UDO, as well as these projects receive the kind of concierge service that's currently provided to help move affordable housing developers through the plan review and permitting process. Even so, the developers that we've talked to initially have said this is a good start, but consider additional incentives as a way to round out some kind of package. Next slide. Additionally, under the recently adopted council policy, the source of income protections would apply to developments participating in this pilot program. The reimbursement would be done as an actual reimbursement, so required fees would be paid at the time due and reimbursed upon verification. And monitoring and compliance, we would do similar to the asset monitoring we do on so many other different types of units and developments where they would be monitored as part of the housing's asset management portfolio. Next slide. And finally, the meat of it here, in consultation with the budget office, the recommendation would be for a pilot program, allocate up to $1.5 million of ARPA funds to test this idea. We believe we could get 3 to 4 projects at that funding level, depending on if they are the 50% projects or 75 or 100% reimbursement. we would propose periodic updates to city council and an evaluation after 1 year or at time of the full allocation of those funds, whichever is earlier. And with that, I will pause and turn it back to you, Chair.
Allison, did you have anything? Nope. Okay. All right, I got a couple things. I just want some clarity before we open up discussion to the larger committee. When you said 1.5 million for the ARPA funds, just to be clear, how much more do we have left that is uncommitted?
That question earlier.
Yeah, so with ARPA related to housing, between the first and second installments, it was 47 million total. So far, council has approved 8 million for the Pepper Tree NOAA, so you have 39 million available.
39 million available. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I've got some questions, but I will yield. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll go through the slides, going back to slide 3, supporting affordable housing and development. So under construction, we have in here sidewalk cost reimbursement as well as development fee reimbursement. Luckily, we're at the beginning of creating this language because I want to make sure that we're thinking long-term and looking at today. We see a lot of outside investment that has come into our city. We know that years ago, the General Assembly took away, created language that removed our ability to track some of these developers and to be able to immediately contact them if there was concerns. I want to make sure that we're not creating a space that is so development friendly that is going to hurt the residents as far as our tax dollar investment. So I would like to get a little bit more information soon regarding what that could look like for sidewalk cost reimbursement, because we know that that is an important part of our connectivity and our transportation accessibility. Ultimately, apples and oranges. What I don't want to happen is what we see in Uptown right now. Years ago, we approved projects, previous councils approved projects that said part of your community give back is you're going to have X number of on-street parking. That's for the community. Fast forward, we're in 2022, you drive through Uptown today, there is no access to public parking. Either the majority of the public parking is used for restaurants as their VIP parking, or we have signs all through Uptown and the immediate area saying no parking Saturday and Sunday, no parking during this time. But when we originally approved these projects, council approved these projects with language of the community good is that you're going to have X number of public parking spaces. What I don't want is for us to set ourselves up where we're creating some language now that is going to be loosely interpreted, that is going to turn into yet something that we promised the community that we've changed our mind on or evaluated as not to be a priority. So I would like to get a little bit more information regarding that sidewalk. When we say that the city fees are only about 1% to 2% of the total development cost, then having some actual numbers around that, because a percentage can be very subjective. What are some actual numbers around what that impact could be? Because there are so many needs that are happening on the ground. I just don't want us creating this free-for-all or anything that could be interpreted as a free-for-all that may hurt us. When we get to the next slide of the program design project qualifications, we have in here minimum of 5 units. We need to increase that. That minimum, even though some developers are saying, well, it's a challenge to get 20% of 60% AMI, we have to look at the realities of what's happening right now. Some of our same partners that we have utilized are also the ones who are getting in and purchasing and or building complete rental residential communities. We should not be trying to figure out a way to make it even more comfortable for you to continue to make money at the cost of tax dollars. Because if we don't figure out something, our residents that are paying these taxes will not be able to afford to live in this city. So we have to look at the impact of the language that we're creating. Minimum of 5 units, we got to figure out if we can push that number up, especially if we're talking about 50, 75, or 100% reimbursement. If we're going to break that down to 50, 75, 100, then this baseline qualifications need to also reflect which one of these percentages that you may potentially have accessible to you. You don't get 50% or 100% by doing a minimum of 5 units. That minimum needs to come up. May be rental units or for sale. I am not comfortable. That rental we really need to have a different conversation, because if we're going to say maybe rental, we need to put a cap on what that rent amount is, especially when we go in later and talk about our subsidies. Here's the reality. If I am working and what I can afford is $600 a month, but what you're charging as a partner is $1,800 a month, we need to be paying attention to how much is this subsidy to fill that gap. You don't get to just create whatever your market rate is because you're using tax dollars. These tax dollars are just that, tax dollars. And if our residents are already struggling, we're not here to play your personal bank for business to figure out how to make you make the most profit that you possibly can. We got to figure out some language that actually protects our residents and protects our resident tax dollars. Right now, we've done it before. We've been in this place. We've made some decisions. We've made some agreements. Those agreements have come back and bit us in the butt. It would be helpful to know that we're acknowledging that and we're creating language that is much more confined to what our goals are and not so loose where, well, the development community say they're not going to build. Okay, I would challenge that notion, because we're not hurting right now for development in our city, but we are hurting on the type of development that has come into our city and the impact that it's had on our workers and our residents. My last one is the program design, other considerations. Again, the developer feedback is 20% at 60 AMI as a high bar. It would be helpful if you all can bring back a report on the communities where it is working, because we do know that there are communities where it is working. Let's actually do a comparison and do a factual comparison opposed to a what if. This is what our development community is telling us, but we know that it is getting done in other places. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. This to me feels like we really pushed the envelope. I love it. I think it addresses the issue. So thank you. This is a great first step. So thank you to Allison or whichever departments and teams worked on this. I do have a couple of questions, and thank you to Councilmember Mayfield. Since you're talking about raising the bar, okay. So I would want to know, when is the developer listening session? I would like to hear from the developers, just to hear the concerns. I also wanted to know, what is the logic in excluding the affordable housing providers who are receiving city tax credit or whatever assistance? Why are we excluding them?
Sure. So this will go back to some of the data that we shared in the October meeting. When, for example, a project, say a housing trust fund project, receives funding. I can use a specific example. So let's say Evoke at Arrowwood. The total development cost there is 31 million, and that was a housing trust fund ask of, I don't know off the top of my head, but let's say 2 million. So that's a ballpark, right, for a housing trust fund project. And the development fees for that project were 275,000. Built into that 2 million of funding that the city already agreed to as part of the Housing Trust Fund gap financing is the total cost of development, which includes those fees. So for a housing trust fund project or a project where a development is receiving any gap financing, they're receiving that gap financing based on the total cost of the project. Thank you, Allison. It's really good to be able to tag team these presentations. So based on that total development cost is how the gap funding is calculated. And built into that development cost are all of the fees. And so they're conceptually already being reimbursed for those fees.
So, using that example, if Evoke is 31 million, right? Okay, Evoke is 31 million, and the city contributed 2 million, then that's still 29 million that Evoke is responsible for raising, right? So I know it covers the fees, but I mean, just doing the math, could they, because what I think about, I think of market rate developers and asking them for 20% of their units to be at 60% AMI. While that would be wonderful, I don't know how much it's going to be utilized. So if there are developers that we know can benefit from it, I don't know why we're excluding them if they still have the $29 million that they're going to be responsible for. I'm just thinking about it. And so maybe we can talk about that more offline, because I'm sure you considered it, but I just need to understand that. Evoke, what? I'm sorry. Evoke, she was giving an example. Evoke was an affordable housing project, tax credit project.
Oh.
So she was just giving, multifamily. She was giving an example of those numbers and the $2 million assistance, what was included in that, right? Yeah, so, okay. And then I would also, as far as the 100% reimbursement, I'd also want to ensure that these projects resolve or allow our most vulnerable and hardest to house in those projects. So Tara Peel, she presented a presentation during the COVID Ad Hoc Housing Committee. If you can reach out to her, Sean, and she's with Housing Collaboration?
Right.
She presented a great presentation, if I recall correctly, about the barriers to housing. I think we could use something like that to make sure that we are addressing the needs of our most vulnerable and make sure that any developer who's getting 100% waiver, that they are addressing all of our residents' needs, or at least attempting to. So, or at least that those issues are considered and not overlooked.
Could you go back to slide 8, please? So thank you for reading between the lines for us, Councilmember Johnson, because when we say projects that prioritize units for voucher and subsidy holders and accept placements from the city's contracted partners, Housing Collaborative is one of those contracted partners. And so we work with Housing Collaborative and several others in the ecosystem to help some of the hardest to house households, whether they have vouchers and subsidies or not, find housing through the housing search that our partners provide and the relationships they build with landlords. So we can certainly bring some of the information back about what some of the barriers are, but the 100% reimbursement was intended to address that level where we're really able to, through our partners, create a pathway from people looking for help who are going to places like Housing Collaborative and then finding housing by partnering with developments where we already have a relationship.
Just as a process check, we've got 10 minutes remaining. Okay. Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah, thank you. So this is an interesting potential new tool, and I'm always grateful when council pushes staff to come up with new ideas. So this is interesting. But I think Ms. Watlington asked the right initial question about ARPA dollars. How much is left in here? And I think the committee is going to have to consider this, and council, pretty closely. We kind of talk about ARPA dollars like there's a kind of like a never-ending hole, but they're going to run out. We hope that it runs out really soon because we need to get those dollars working. In light of the conversation that we had 2 weeks ago about the funding, the gaps in housing trust fund gap financing, we need to know kind of what are we kind of thinking about using all these ARPA dollars for. I think even with the replenishment of the housing trust fund from the 4% deal, the 9% deals that didn't go through, it's still leaving a significant upper $20 million gap. We just said it. We have $29 million left in ARPA housing funds. So this committee is going to have to. Was that 39? Oh, 39. About how do we prioritize things like these big gap funding ideas and ideas like this pilot. We need to really visualize, I think, all these ideas that we have out there and what we'll actually be able to pay for with specifically ARPA dollars, which leads to my second question. Again, this is a good idea, but what I see this is as a pilot, and this pilot is going to be funded by ARPA dollars. If this pilot was successful, and this is something that we wanted to do in perpetuity, how would we fund this program? This doesn't seem like we would use housing trust fund dollars to do this. Where would that funding come from, and what are the kind of opportunity costs that we'll have to consider in terms of giving developers, reimbursing developers for their fees?
So the options are really, what we discussed last time is that the reimbursement has to come out of the general fund, right? So the options there are allocating funding from PAYGO, or leveraging the Housing Trust Fund in a different way. So, for example, we would, for the pilot, we're trying to cultivate opportunities, but if this worked and it became a permanent program, it would be something where we would recommend developers have to apply and be stacked against one another. And so the Housing Trust Fund could potentially be leveraged in that way, but the most likely source of funds would be PAYGO dollars, and the opportunity costs would be anything else that those PAYGO dollars are used for.
And so this wouldn't be seen as a tax remediation because these are city fees. So this would be something that we could legally do. There's a legal framework for that.
Yes, under the legal framework, we would be able to do this. It's been carefully designed with our attorney staff, so yes, this is legal.
As a reimbursement, not as a waiver.
That's the key.
Yeah.
It's the reimbursement is the first key, and 20% at 60% is the second.
Per state statutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got 6 minutes left. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Bakari, and then I'll close us out.
I'll be brief, thank you. What I had really wanted to see was a larger scope than this, but I'll just ask it generically. What is the average annual fee generation the city gets overall from development fees? Is it closer to 1 million, 50 million, 100 million, or 500 million?
I don't have a sense. I don't want to throw out a wild estimate.
That's a number I can get, but I don't have it.
I'd love to see that, because you got to think, if it's 1 to 2% of total development costs, if just what we've looked at of housing trust fund approvals since 2020 includes 232K for water infrastructure fees and 20K for plan review fees, my assumption is it's a large number. Pretty material. And the way the world works is that whatever that dollar amount is, that gets passed on in some form or fashion to the end customer, to the end homeowner, to the end renter, and it impacts the affordability of housing. So my gut reaction to all this is, it's nice, but it's not, it's going to be equivalent to throwing a couple pebbles into the ocean. People likely won't even use it, much like the Aging in Place program. And if they do, the most you could get out of 1.5 million is probably at 100% reimbursement, 2 to 4 projects. So we're not moving any needles. It's not material. And even with that, if we went and said we're putting 50 million of the next housing bond towards it, we're still throwing pebbles at the problem. So what I'd love to see is, what is that overall dollar amount of the, because if you look at fees for development paired with the time we take for rezoning that they're sitting on and their costs are building up, paired with the time and the bureaucracy and red tape around permitting, that's that 30+% of overhead that we talk about that comes over top and impacts the affordability of housing. That's where we move the needle if we could figure out, okay, let's just start with, let's look at that and then see, all right, I think it's less about subsidizing that and more about saying, should we be in that business? Can we get out of that? And that's the real body of work that's been needed for the last 5 years, in my opinion, that we haven't even gotten a glimpse of. So if I could get a glimpse at what that number looks like, broken down by those areas, again, this is nice, but it's not gonna move any needles. We're just gonna be doing stuff.
Thank you, sir. So a couple of things. I think obviously we'd like to see this again at some point before we're able to take action on it. I like what I see overall. Thank you for bringing this back and with the speed with which you brought it back. Certainly there's more out there that we can go look at, but we got to start somewhere. And so I appreciate that we're here. I like the framework that we've set up. I like the thought that's gone behind really trying to target the things that we care about and what we're trying to incentivize. I think that marries up nicely with some of the things that we've been talking about overall as we say, what is our comprehensive plan goals to get there. And so I see a lot of the touch points here. So I appreciate how you all have crafted this program. So good work on this. I just got a couple of things. As far as the tiers, I too am very interested as I think about what we're trying to deliver. And as I look over at our summit potential topics and home ownership being one, I would love to see us really figure out how we incentivize for sale units, even over and above the rental units. I think that could be a very powerful tool to get more for sale units here, because we see with our housing trust fund that it's by and large rental properties. And so if there's a way that we can really hone in on what would make a for sale opportunity attractive utilizing this program, that would be great. And also location-based. So I know obviously for our housing trust fund, there's a location component. I'm wondering what the thought was here, or if it's already baked in somewhere in regards to trying to incentivize building in certain areas.
The idea of being able to incentivize affordable units in market rate construction is intended to broaden the location across the city where the affordable housing units can go. Because currently there are some constraints in the way that the tax credit program works to where city dollars can best be leveraged for affordable housing development, particularly through the housing trust fund when it's paired with those tax credits. So in general, the idea is anything that would incentivize affordable housing units in market rate developments would broaden the geography, and then this would activate the development allowances in the UDO, which does have a geographic component where there's additional tiers related to what the development can achieve through development allowances by being in high-cost locations. So this is really intended to be a tool that can pair with the development allowances in the UDO, and that does have a geographic component.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then, the other piece was just a quick one, it's the information piece. We'd just like to understand an update on what is the need, because as we look at this slide that talks about developer feedback, 20% at 60% AMI is a high bar, consider additional alternatives. We want to incentivize the need more than anything. And so I think it would be helpful for us to understand what is the need from an AMI perspective, and really focus on
The data team just crunched those numbers and delivered them to me today. So shout out to Jackie Tynan, who worked very hard over the last week in response to that question that came up recently. So we will have a update on the overall housing affordability gap very soon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It is 5:31. I know that we all have to transition over to the next meeting, so I will not hold us up. Thank you for your work, and we will see you all next meeting.
Second.